Everything you thought you knew about Vikings is wrong. The classic image of a tall, blonde-haired warrior, draped in fur, wielding an axe, and sailing across the seas to raid distant lands is only part of the story. What if I told you that Vikings weren't even purely Scandinavian? That some had dark hair, others had roots in southern Europe or even Asia, and some Viking warriors weren't Vikings at all? Recent breakthroughs in DNA research have shattered the myths we've believed for centuries. Scientists have sequenced the DNA of over 400 Viking-age skeletons from across Europe and Greenland, uncovering a shocking truth. Vikings weren't just a single, isolated group of people. Their bloodlines were a melting pot of different ancestries, proving that the world of the Vikings was far more complex than we ever imagined. Picture this: you're standing in a Viking burial ground in Scotland. You expect to find the remains of fierce Norse warriors, right? But instead, DNA testing reveals something surprising. Some of these Viking burials contain people with no Scandinavian ancestry at all. They were local Scots or Picts who had adopted Viking culture, dressed like Vikings, and were buried with Viking weapons. But genetically, they weren't Vikings. So what does this mean? Were these people assimilated into Viking society? Were they slaves who rose through the ranks? Or were they simply people who embraced the Viking way of life? And that's just the beginning. The idea that all Vikings were blonde, that's another myth. In fact, DNA evidence shows that many Vikings had brown or even black hair. The modern-day Scandinavian population is actually more blonde than the Vikings ever were. And here's where it gets even crazier. Some Viking DNA traces back to southern Europe and even Central Asia. So, how did all this happen? How did Viking genes spread across the world? And why are some of them disappearing today? The truth is, Vikings weren't just raiders. They were traders, explorers, and settlers. They sailed far beyond Scandinavia, reaching Britain, Ireland, Russia, and even North America centuries before Columbus. But as they moved, they mixed with the local populations, leaving behind genetic footprints that can still be found in people today. But here's something strange. Some regions of Scandinavia had more foreign ancestry during the Viking Age than they do today. That means over time, Viking-era genetic influences faded, replaced by new waves of migration and cultural shifts. So, if Viking DNA is disappearing, what does that mean for their legacy? The answer lies in what we're discovering today. Scientists are still analyzing ancient genomes, unlocking new clues about who the Vikings really were and how their genetic history continues to shape us. The Viking Age wasn't just about fierce warriors setting sail to raid foreign lands. It was a time of massive cultural exchange, migration, and surprising genetic transformations. When scientists analyzed nearly 300 ancient Scandinavian genomes, they uncovered a stunning reality. Vikings weren't just spreading their culture across Europe. They were also absorbing new people, new ideas, and even new DNA. Take Britain, for example. We've long known that Vikings raided and settled in places like England, Scotland, and Ireland. But what we didn't realize until now is how much they took back with them. DNA evidence proves that many individuals who returned to Scandinavia weren't just Viking-born Scandinavians. They were mixed with British and Irish ancestry. Some were likely captives taken from raids, forced into new lives across the sea. Others may have been high-status individuals, like Christian monks or nobles, brought over as advisors or political allies. And then, there's the eastward expansion. Vikings didn't just travel west. They moved into what is now Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic region. This brought another genetic shift. Studies show that Eastern Baltic ancestry was particularly strong in places like Gotland and central Sweden. But here's where it gets strange. Those high levels of Eastern ancestry in Viking-age Scandinavians have mostly disappeared in modern-day populations. So, what happened? Did those genetic lines simply die out? Were later migrations responsible for replacing those genes? The full answer is still being uncovered. But one thing is clear. Viking DNA was not static. It was constantly evolving, shifting, and blending with the world around it. And this north-south genetic divide in Scandinavia, that didn't just happen recently. It's been in place since at least the Viking Age. People in northern Scandinavia show a distinct genetic profile, one with strong connections to Uralic-speaking populations, like the Sami. Meanwhile, those in southern Scandinavia have genetic links that stretch as far as southern Europe. That means the Viking world wasn't just a monolithic group of blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors. It was a complex and diverse society with multiple ancestral influences. But even with all these genetic shifts, one surprising trend stands out. Vikings from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden didn't mix with each other as much as we might think. Instead, they had their own distinct travel and migration patterns. Danish Vikings primarily moved west to England. Swedish Vikings traveled east into the Baltic and beyond. And Norwegian Vikings set their sights on Ireland, Scotland, and Iceland. Why did they stick to these separate paths? Was it political, cultural, or just a matter of geography? Whatever the reason, Viking DNA tells us that these groups stayed more separate than we ever realized. And yet, for all their traveling, raiding, and intermingling, the Viking genetic legacy is more complicated than we once thought. Some of their genetic influence was long-lasting, shaping modern populations. But in other cases, Viking-era ancestry was absorbed, diluted, or even disappeared entirely. What we're left with is a genetic puzzle, one that scientists are only now beginning to piece together. For centuries, the image of a Viking has been tied to the idea of a pure Scandinavian warrior, tall, blonde, and genetically distinct. But when researchers analyzed ancient Viking DNA, they discovered something completely unexpected. Vikings weren't just Scandinavian in ancestry. They were a genetic mix of various populations, influenced by centuries of migration, trade, and conquest. The biggest surprise: many Vikings weren't even blonde. Modern Scandinavians today actually have a higher percentage of blonde hair than the Vikings themselves did. DNA evidence shows that Vikings had a diverse range of hair colors, with many having brown or even dark hair. This challenges the long-held stereotype and proves that Viking identity wasn't tied to a single look. It was a cultural identity rather than just a genetic one. And it wasn't just hair color that varied. Genetic studies revealed that Viking-era Scandinavians carried ancestry from places as far apart as southern Europe and Central Asia. This means that long before the Viking Age, foreign genes were already mixing into the Scandinavian population. Whether through early trade routes, migrations, or conflicts, the genetic history of the Vikings was far more complex than we ever imagined. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery is how people from outside Scandinavia adopted Viking culture. In Scotland and England, researchers uncovered Viking-style burials that belonged to individuals with no Scandinavian ancestry at all. They had been buried with Viking swords, shields, and other artifacts, suggesting they had fully embraced the Viking way of life. Some of these individuals may have been local warriors who joined Viking forces, while others could have been part of Viking settlements, integrating into the community despite their non-Scandinavian origins. This pattern wasn't just limited to the British Isles. As Vikings traveled across Europe and beyond, they encountered new cultures and people, some of whom joined them, fought alongside them, or even became part of their communities. The Viking world was one of constant movement and interaction, where identity was shaped as much by culture as it was by ancestry. And yet, for all their genetic diversity, Vikings remained a distinct force in history. They carried their traditions, beliefs, and skills across continents, leaving a lasting impact on the world. But the idea of a genetically pure Viking, that's a myth. The real story of Viking DNA is one of change, adaptation, and an ever-evolving mix of peoples. The Viking Age was an era of expansion, trade, and war. But what many people don't realize is just how much migration influenced the genetic makeup of the Vikings themselves. For centuries, we assumed that Vikings were purely Scandinavian. But DNA evidence tells a different story, one that involves an intricate web of movement, settlement, and cultural blending. One of the most significant sources of foreign ancestry in Viking-era Scandinavia came from the British and Irish Isles. Researchers found that from the Viking Age onward, British and Irish DNA became a common part of the Scandinavian gene pool. This wasn't a minor influence, it was widespread, appearing in Viking burials across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But how did this happen? We know that Vikings raided and settled in the British Isles, capturing land and establishing cities. But not everyone who made the journey across the North Sea was a warrior. Some were traders, others were settlers looking for new land, and many were enslaved people taken by force. The Vikings had a vast slave trade, and many of the people they captured were brought back to Scandinavia. Over time, this led to the integration of British and Irish ancestry into the population. But this wasn't just one-sided. Some individuals from the British Isles willingly became part of Viking society, joining their ranks and adapting to their way of life. One of the most striking examples is a Viking woman found in Sweden, buried with traditional Viking artifacts. DNA analysis revealed that she had no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Her genes pointed entirely to the British Isles. Yet, her burial suggests she held an important position in Viking society. Was she the daughter of an enslaved person who rose in status? A noble woman who married into a powerful Viking family? We may never know the full story, but it proves that Viking identity wasn't just about genetics. It was about culture, status, and integration. And it wasn't just people from the British Isles who influenced the Viking gene pool. Ancient DNA reveals that migration from the East Baltic region, modern-day Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, also left its mark. But unlike British and Irish ancestry, which spread widely, Baltic ancestry was more localized. It was primarily found in Gotland and central Sweden, places that had strong trade connections with the East. The presence of Baltic ancestry among the Vikings likely came from both peaceful trade and conflict. The Vikings didn't just raid, they were also master merchants, traveling deep into Eastern Europe and beyond. They traded furs, amber, and weapons, sometimes forming alliances and sometimes taking captives. This exchange of goods and people contributed to the genetic diversity of Scandinavia. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this genetic mixing is what happened to these foreign ancestries over time. Modern Scandinavians still carry traces of British, Irish, and Baltic DNA, but to a lesser degree than their Viking Age ancestors. This suggests that while these groups became part of Viking society, their genes weren't passed down in equal proportions. Whether due to later migrations, social hierarchies, or other factors, many of the genetic influences from the Viking Age have faded. What we see today is just a fraction of the complex genetic history that shaped the Vikings. They weren't a single, uniform people. They were a blend of cultures, shaped by war, trade, and migration. Their legacy isn't just in the lands they conquered or the myths they left behind. It's in the very DNA of modern Scandinavians, carrying the hidden stories of countless journeys across the seas. While the British and Irish Isles played a significant role in shaping Viking DNA, another key source of genetic influence came from southern Europe. This is perhaps one of the most surprising discoveries in Viking genetics. Ancient DNA reveals that Vikings carried ancestry from regions as far south as Spain and Italy, places that were never major targets of Viking raids. So how did these genes end up in Scandinavia? One explanation lies in the vast trade networks that the Vikings were part of. They weren't just raiders, they were also merchants who traveled thousands of miles, interacting with diverse civilizations. Viking trade routes stretched deep into the heart of the European continent, reaching the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Middle East. Silver, silk, spices, and slaves were exchanged in bustling trade hubs, and along with goods, people also moved. Some southern Europeans likely traveled north through trade or were taken as captives, eventually integrating into Viking society. One striking piece of evidence comes from an ancient burial in Sweden. A Viking warrior, buried with weapons and traditional Norse artifacts, was found to have a genetic profile that traced back to southern Europe. He wasn't alone. Several individuals from different Viking-era sites showed similar ancestry. This challenges the traditional image of Vikings as a purely Scandinavian people. Some of the most well-respected members of their society may have had origins far beyond the fjords of Norway or the forests of Sweden. The connection between Vikings and southern Europe is also reflected in historical records. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Viking mercenaries, served in the Byzantine Empire, protecting the emperors in Constantinople. These warriors traveled from Scandinavia through Eastern Europe, navigating the rivers that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. Some of them stayed in these southern regions, intermarrying and blending their ancestry with the local populations. Others returned home, bringing back not just wealth and stories, but also new bloodlines. There's also evidence that some southern Europeans willingly joined Viking expeditions. Historical accounts describe Christian missionaries traveling to Scandinavia, hoping to convert the Norse to their faith. Some of these missionaries may have settled, married, and had children, contributing to the genetic landscape. This aligns with the DNA findings, which suggest that Viking-era Scandinavians had some degree of southern European ancestry, even though they were geographically distant from these regions. However, much like the British and Irish DNA, this southern European influence seems to have faded over time. Modern Scandinavians have much lower levels of this ancestry compared to their Viking Age predecessors. Why? The answer may lie in later historical events. As Scandinavian societies became more structured and centralized, migration patterns shifted. The genetic impact of these earlier waves of Southern European influence was gradually diluted as populations mixed in different ways. What's clear is that the Vikings were not an isolated people. Their journeys, whether for war, trade, or exploration, connected them to some of the most powerful civilizations of their time. And these connections weren't just cultural or economic, they were biological. The genes of Southern Europe became part of Viking DNA, just as Viking genes spread across the lands they touched. While much of the genetic influence on Viking DNA came from Western and Southern Europe, another major source was the East, specifically, the Baltic region. This part of Viking ancestry is especially intriguing because it was not as widespread as the British Irish or Southern European influence. Instead, it was highly concentrated in certain regions, particularly Gotland and central Sweden. But why? Gotland, an island in the Baltic Sea, was one of the most important trading centers of the Viking world. Its location made it a crucial link between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. Vikings from Gotland had strong trade connections with the Baltic region, engaging in commerce with present-day Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows a clear Baltic influence, from artifacts to burial traditions. But the genetic link goes even deeper. Ancient DNA reveals that individuals from Viking Age Gotland had significantly higher levels of Baltic ancestry than those from other parts of Scandinavia. This suggests that Baltic people were not just trading partners, they were also settling in Viking communities. Some may have arrived as merchants or craftsmen, drawn by the wealth and opportunities of Viking trade networks. Others could have been captives taken during Viking raids. Historical records describe Vikings attacking and plundering settlements in the Baltic region, sometimes capturing people and bringing them back to Scandinavia. Over time, these individuals integrated into Viking society, contributing to its genetic diversity. Central Sweden also shows a notable concentration of Baltic ancestry. This is particularly interesting because this region was a major political and cultural center during the Viking Age. Some of the most powerful Viking rulers came from central Sweden, and the city of Sigtuna, one of the earliest urban centers in Scandinavia, was located there. The presence of Baltic DNA in this area suggests a deeper connection between the two regions. Some historians believe that Baltic warriors may have served as mercenaries in Viking armies, similar to how Vikings themselves served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard. Others speculate that there were strategic alliances between Viking rulers and Baltic leaders, leading to intermarriage and genetic exchange. But while Baltic ancestry was strong in certain Viking-era populations, its presence in modern Scandinavians is much lower. In fact, today's Scandinavians have about the same level of Baltic ancestry as their pre-Viking ancestors. This suggests that much of the genetic influence from the Baltic region was temporary. But why did it decline? One possible explanation is that Viking-era Scandinavia was more diverse than previously thought, with constant movement of people in and out of the region. Over time, as migration patterns changed and populations mixed, the strong presence of Baltic ancestry was diluted. Another factor could be social hierarchy. Historical records indicate that Viking societies were highly stratified. It's possible that individuals of Baltic ancestry, despite living among the Vikings, were less likely to leave behind a lasting genetic impact. If they were in lower status positions, they may not have had as many surviving descendants compared to the dominant Norse families. Regardless of the reasons, what's clear is that the Vikings were deeply connected to the Baltic world. Their interactions with the eastern lands were not just about raiding and warfare, they were also about trade, alliances, and cultural exchange. And even though the genetic traces of this connection have faded over time, the evidence still remains in the DNA of ancient Viking Age individuals, providing a glimpse into a part of history that was long overlooked. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking DNA is its connection to the Uralic peoples, particularly the Sami and other groups from the far north. Today, Scandinavia has a clear genetic divide between the north and the south, but evidence suggests that this divide existed as far back as the Viking Age, and possibly even earlier. The question is, how did this north-south genetic line develop? Modern Scandinavians show a gradual increase in Uralic ancestry as you move northward. This ancestry is associated with indigenous groups like the Sami, who have historically lived across northern Scandinavia, Finland, and parts of Russia. But the presence of Uralic DNA in Viking-era individuals suggests that the genetic influence of these northern peoples extended further south in the past. In fact, ancient genomes show that Uralic ancestry was already present in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, meaning that Norse and Uralic populations were interacting for centuries before modern national borders even existed. But what was the nature of this interaction? One possibility is trade. The Vikings were expert traders, and their roots extended deep into northern Scandinavia. They had access to highly valuable resources from the Arctic, such as furs, walrus ivory, and reindeer products, which were in high demand across Europe. Historical accounts describe Viking traders venturing far into Sami territory to acquire these goods. It's likely that trade networks brought Sami and Norse people into frequent contact, leading to intermarriage and genetic exchange. Another possibility is that some people of Uralic ancestry were integrated into Viking society. Some historical sources describe the Sami paying tribute to Norse rulers in the form of furs and other goods. But the relationship between the two groups was complex. While there were periods of cooperation and trade, there were also conflicts. Some Viking sagas describe wars and raids against northern groups, which may have resulted in forced assimilation. Interestingly, DNA evidence shows that Uralic ancestry in Viking-era Scandinavia was not evenly distributed. The highest levels are found in northern Norway and Sweden, where interactions with Uralic-speaking peoples would have been most common. However, some Viking-age individuals in central and even southern Sweden also show traces of this ancestry. This suggests that at least some people of Uralic descent migrated southward and settled among the Norse population. One clue to the movement of Uralic ancestry comes from Y-DNA analysis. The Y chromosome haplogroup N1A1, which is strongly associated with Uralic-speaking populations, is found in some ancient Scandinavian individuals. This is significant because it shows a direct genetic link between Viking-age Scandinavians and northern populations. However, while N1A1 was present in Viking-era individuals, it became more geographically restricted over time, eventually being found mostly in northern Scandinavia. This suggests that over the centuries, Norse and Uralic populations became more genetically distinct from each other. So why did Uralic ancestry decline in central and southern Scandinavia? One reason could be the social structure of Viking societies. While the Vikings were known for their openness to cultural exchange, their society was still hierarchical. If people of Uralic descent occupied lower social positions, they may have left behind fewer genetic traces over time. Another possibility is that later migrations diluted the Uralic genetic contribution in southern Scandinavia. The medieval period saw continued movement of people into Scandinavia, which may have reshaped the genetic landscape. Despite these changes, the genetic legacy of the Uralic connection is still visible today. The north-south genetic line in Scandinavia is a direct result of this ancient mixing of populations. And while the Norse and Uralic peoples had distinct cultures, their interactions were a key part of the Viking world. The Vikings were not an isolated group, they were part of a much larger network of people who shaped, and were shaped by, the diverse genetics of early medieval Europe. One of the most surprising revelations about Viking DNA is that many of the people buried in Viking-style graves were not genetically Scandinavian at all. In fact, some of the most famous Viking burial sites contain individuals whose ancestry traces back to regions far beyond Scandinavia. This challenges the traditional image of the Vikings as a homogeneous group and suggests that Viking identity was more about culture than genetics. A perfect example of this comes from Orkney, Scotland, where several individuals buried with swords and other Viking artifacts had DNA that was entirely British or Irish. These people had no Scandinavian ancestry at all, yet they were given Viking-style burials. Why? The most likely explanation is that they had adopted Norse customs, either by choice or through assimilation. This suggests that being a Viking wasn't strictly about where you were born. It was a cultural identity that people could take on regardless of their ancestry. This phenomenon wasn't limited to Orkney. In various locations across Europe, individuals with little or no Scandinavian ancestry have been found buried in Viking graves. In some cases, these individuals were likely high-status members of Viking communities. Others may have been enslaved people, taken during Viking raids and later integrated into Norse society. The Vikings were known to capture and trade slaves, particularly from the British Isles and Eastern Europe, and some of these individuals might have eventually become part of Viking settlements. Even within Scandinavia, Viking DNA reveals a high degree of genetic diversity. Some individuals buried in classic Viking locations, such as central Sweden, show strong genetic links to the British Isles, the eastern Baltic, and even southern Europe. These findings suggest that people from outside Scandinavia were not just being captured or raided, they were also moving to Scandinavia and becoming part of Viking society. Some may have arrived as traders or settlers, while others could have come as missionaries or political emissaries. One striking example of this is the discovery of a high-status female burial in Sweden. Genetic analysis revealed that this woman had ancestry from the British Isles, yet she was buried in a traditional Norse manner. This raises fascinating questions. Was she a second-generation immigrant whose family had already settled in Scandinavia? Or was she a foreign noblewoman who married into a Viking family? Her burial suggests that she was not seen as an outsider but rather as someone fully integrated into Norse society. Another interesting case is a woman found in Denmark, dating back to the 5th century, long before the height of the Viking Age. Her DNA showed strong links to the British Isles, making her one of the earliest known examples of British-Irish ancestry in Scandinavia. This suggests that migration and cultural exchange between the British Isles and Scandinavia were happening even earlier than we once thought. The idea that Viking identity was fluid and adaptable helps explain why Viking expansion was so successful. Rather than enforcing a strict ethnic barrier, Viking societies seem to have been open to outsiders, at least in certain cases. This adaptability allowed them to establish settlements in places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, where they mixed with local populations. It also made them formidable in trade, diplomacy, and warfare. Modern genetic studies confirm that the influence of Viking ancestry extends far beyond Scandinavia. In the United Kingdom, for example, around 6% of people still carry Viking DNA. In Sweden, that number rises to around 10%. These figures show that Viking migrations left a lasting imprint on the genetic landscape of Europe. Ultimately, the study of Viking DNA reveals that the Viking Age was not just a story of conquest and raiding. It was a time of deep cultural exchange and integration. The Vikings were far more diverse than we once thought, both in their origins and in the way they incorporated others into their society. Their legacy is not just in the lands they traveled to, but in the people they became. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking DNA research is its impact on how we understand modern Scandinavian genetics. For centuries, Scandinavians have been thought of as a distinct population with a shared heritage, but ancient DNA tells a more complex story. It reveals that the Viking Age was a period of intense migration, cultural exchange, and genetic mixing, factors that shaped not only the Vikings themselves but also their modern descendants. One of the clearest genetic markers found in Scandinavia today is a north-to-south genetic gradient. This pattern, which still exists in modern Scandinavian populations, is largely influenced by Uralic ancestry in the north and increased European ancestry in the south. The presence of Uralic DNA in northern Sweden and Norway suggests that there was early mixing with Sami and other Uralic-speaking groups. This was not just a Viking Age phenomenon but part of a much longer history of genetic exchange in the region. Interestingly, while Viking DNA shows a strong influence from outside groups, especially from the British Irish Isles and the eastern Baltic, some of these genetic signatures have become less prominent over time. This suggests that the Viking and medieval periods saw an influx of foreign ancestry that was later diluted by subsequent generations. In other words, while Viking society was highly diverse, modern Scandinavians do not necessarily have the same proportions of foreign ancestry as their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. One of the most unexpected discoveries in Viking DNA research is that many modern Scandinavians have less genetic similarity to the Vikings than previously assumed. In fact, modern Scandinavians are, in some ways, genetically more distinct from their Viking ancestors than people in other parts of Europe who still carry strong traces of Viking ancestry. This is because the population structure of Scandinavia continued to change long after the Viking Age, with new waves of migration and internal mixing altering the genetic makeup of the region. For example, in areas like Denmark and southern Sweden, Viking DNA analysis shows that there was significant gene flow from southern Europe. This genetic influence may have arrived through trade, diplomacy, or even military campaigns, as Vikings often came into contact with Mediterranean cultures. Meanwhile, in Norway and Iceland, British-Irish ancestry remains a key component of genetic identity, a direct result of Viking raids, settlements, and intermarriage with local populations. Beyond Scandinavia, Viking genetic influence is still present in many parts of Europe today. In the United Kingdom, genetic studies suggest that a substantial portion of the population, particularly in areas like Scotland and the Orkney Islands, still carries Viking ancestry. In Iceland, around 60% of modern male lineages can be traced back to Viking settlers, while the maternal lineages show a strong British and Irish influence, reflecting the historical capture and migration of women from those regions. The Viking legacy extends even further, reaching into parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, where Scandinavian traders and warriors known as the Varangians played a key role in shaping early Slavic states. Genetic studies confirm that Viking influence in these areas was not just cultural but also biological, with clear traces of Scandinavian ancestry still detectable in modern populations. The study of Viking DNA is reshaping our understanding of history in profound ways. It shows that the Vikings were not a monolithic group but a diverse and dynamic people who incorporated different ancestries into their societies. It reveals that Viking identity was as much about culture and lifestyle as it was about genetics. And perhaps most importantly, it highlights how interconnected human history truly is, how people, ideas, and genes have always moved across borders, shaping the world we live in today.